Going into Queer, I had expectations, and then there was a reality of what the movie is. Directed by Luca Guadagnino, who has brought us such films as Call Me By Your Name, and recently, as of this year, Challengers. I thought this movie, I was going to be able to describe it in a few ways. I thought it was going to be a sexy movie. I thought it was going to be a passionate movie. And I thought it was going to be an intimate movie. I think those characteristics are in this film, but I wouldn't describe this film as any of these three things. In fact, I'd go as far as to call this film almost the total opposite of those three things. This movie feels like a fever dream. It is a film about self-loathing. It is a film that is designed to be at a distance. This is essentially the opposite of what we've come to expect from Luca as a filmmaker in his last few films, whether it be Challengers, whether it be Bones and All, whether it be Call Me By Your Name. This is not a movie that, as I kind of thought it would be, a celebration of queerdom. And maybe this is my non-understanding of the William S. Burroughs novel, which I have never read. I'm not particularly familiar with William S. Burroughs novels, minus the just broader generation of writers that he comes from in the 1950s, post-World War II. Rather, what Queer is about as a movie, it's a movie, as I would describe it in my own words, it is a movie about a man destroyed by a sexuality that society rejects and the damage that does to somebody's psyche. That is how I describe Queer. But for those who are unfamiliar with this movie, let me jump into it. To understand Queer, you need to understand the context of which it exists. So here is a brief understanding. It is a semi-autobiographical novel by beat writer William S. Burroughs. He is this beat writer that comes back post-World War II. This is really a generation of the 1950s and 60s. They're basically kind of rejecting all of American tradition, far more sexual liberation than before. And in this case of the case of William S. Burroughs, fictionalized in this movie as William Lee, as played by Daniel Craig, this film is loosely based on William S. Burroughs' life. He is a veteran who flees the U.S. from Mexico City to drink, abuse, and life away until he meets a young student named Eugene, to whom he forms a meaningful connection with. That's the broad understanding of Queer as a plot. What is Queer actually about? What are the themes of Queer? As I would describe it in my own words, this is a film that follows a broken man who is forced into solitude by societal constraints that manifest in self-destructive behaviors, only to meet a man to whom he finds connection with, but it's too late for William to actually form anything true because his life is just so far gone by the time he meets this man. This is the broad scope of which Queer exists. And before we move any further, if you're liking this review, make sure to like and subscribe. It really helps me grow my channel and get me to see these movies early. So do that real quick. But jumping back into this review, as I understand Queer to be, I understand Queer is a tribute/reflection to generations of queer men lost to history. And as I thought about this, I was thinking a lot about this, the lost generation of the 1920s. This is the people who essentially did not return from World War I. These were the people that were killed, essentially this lost generation of men who weren't able to come home. I think that idea shares a lot of similarity into what we're seeing with the Beat generation, specifically gay men who came home from the war and still were not accepted anyway in society, and specifically American society. So in the case of William S. Burroughs, in this character that he is loosely based on him, William Lee, he has to leave the United States, and essentially he has to not forego his queerness, but he has to forego it in the country that he served. And I think that's a big idea of this movie, is essentially something that was lost / something that was never even allowed to be owned. And that's his own queerdom and the self-destructive nature that this movie has, or this psyche has on him. And that's what this movie is exploring. What Queer is not about. Queer is not about bigotry. It is not about conservatism. However, they are rooted in this film. It's never actually something that's necessarily explored, but the thematic weight of it is there, and it's specifically there by the Daniel Craig performance. It's a performance, and especially all the characters in this film, but specifically the Craig performance and his co-star in the movie, played by Drew Starkey. It is a film where all the characters are informed by bigotry, by conservatism, essentially this hush hush about their queerness. And they form this kind of society in Mexico City where they are allowed to be a bit more liberated. But even then, there is still a down low. You have to be careful with who you communicate with it. And you're always kind of playing this guessing game of, are they straight? Are they gay? That's a big idea of this movie. And the characters are all informed by it. And this is a movie, and especially this Craig performance, which we'll get to in a second, where you have to flee just to live a life in secret. Like, they are fleeing to live a better life, and even in that better life, they're still living in secrecy. These are a lot of powerful ideas being explored in the movie Queer, and I'll just kind of say it now before I get into the Daniel Craig performance. This was a movie that I really wanted to love because I am a huge Luca Guadagnino fan. I have been a big fan of what Daniel Craig has been doing post his Bond run, and ultimately I found this movie a bit frustrating, which we'll get into it, but it's not really based on the Daniel Craig performance, which let's just talk about it right now. All these ideas that I talked about, this idea of the lack of bigotry, the lack of conservatism, but even though they're never mentioned in this film, that everything's being informed by it, none of these ideas are communicated in the script. It's actually all communicated through Daniel Craig's performance as the leading man, as the semi-autobiographical William S. Burroughs character named William Lee in this movie. And it's a pretty tremendous performance from Daniel Craig. And I have to give him a lot of credit because I think this performance is particularly hard to pull off, especially with the script that Daniel Craig is given. By that, I mean this movie does not really let you get into the context of this movie. There is a introduction to who this guy is, but it's never really explained. For instance, we don't really have this understanding of his past, what leads him to Mexico City. We get the broad strokes of it, but this film doesn't really get into portraying who this guy is and having a great understanding. Rather, we're kind of just drop down with him in this world and seeing the world as he lives it. And that's a really challenging thing to do. And I think Daniel Craig is largely up for that part. And everything that Craig does so well as an actor, he brings to this role. He has a suaveness to him. He has the devilish charm that we know so well. He has the brooding, dark nature that he's done so well in his whole career. It's what's made him a superstar. It's what makes him an interesting James Bond. All of these qualities are in this movie, and they are delicately used in this movie. Luca is able to pull the best out of Daniel Craig to get something unique and special, and to also have Daniel Craig, again, being the representation of masculinity, because let's face it, James Bond is the definition of masculinity for 20th and 21st century men. Like, that is truly one of the defining masculine figures in pop culture. And so to take Daniel Craig post his James Bond career and plop him in a movie like Queer is fundamentally really interesting to see Daniel Craig play these roles, to have a emotional darkness to him, for this character to have a flamboyant nature at times, but never be overly flamboyant. He's not playing a caricature by any means. He is not doing what I would call some of the, let's just call it, for lack of a better word, gay face, something that I think Sean Penn may fall into in the film Milk, something where it's just like he is playing it very over the top. That's not what Daniel Craig is doing in Queer. It's a far more nuanced, careful, delicate balance that Daniel Craig is able to hit. And as Daniel Craig is always so good at being able to do, this film requires a bit of comedy out of him and a bit of just light humor that he's able to deliver. And Daniel Craig is just a master of this, especially in the first act of this movie. His romantic banter is wonderfully used and captivated in this movie. And so I really respect the performance that they get out of here. And specifically his screen partner, Drew Starkey, who plays his pseudo lover in this film. And I say pseudo in the fact that their relationship is not the traditional boyfriend-boyfriend. There's a little bit more complex. They certainly have a relationship and a bond, but it is never as easy as to being able to put a label on it. They are lovers, and they also have a disconnect that feels real, and it's specifically a disconnect with the William Lee character that he has with the Drew Starkey character. in this film, but it's a pretty wonderful performance from Starkey. I think it's very interesting to note that essentially Starkey is the much younger character in this film as Eugene, that Daniel Craig's character of William takes an interest to. I think it's very fascinating how much Drew Starkey looks like a young Daniel Craig in this movie and has the same body type, has the same archetype. At one point, there's a scene where they're both in pretty short shorts at a beach, and it just so reminded me of Casino Royale, especially Starkey and how he looked in this scene. But I think it's a pretty great thing that Luca is able to get out. So I'm praising this movie, and it really sounds like I'm liking this. So what's the disconnect here? And I want to just say right now, Luca Guadagnino is a wonderful director. You will never hear me complain about how he shoots a movie. The eye for capturing something is undeniable. This movie looks beautiful. It is staged so wonderfully. And like Luca is a genius at this, and you can see any of his films, and I think he does it so well. And so you're not going to really hear complaints about the technical side of Luca's direction in this movie. I will say there are some real elements that I think he is just out of his comfort zone for. And that is, this movie has a dreamlike quality, essentially because there is a magical realism element in this movie. So it adds a surreal feeling to Queer. And it is trying to evoke the sense of taking drugs. The movie that kept coming into my mind while thinking and watching Queer was the film Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, which I believe is directed by Terry Gilliam and stars Johnny Depp. That idea of like kind of a drug trip is, I think, what Luca is trying to capture in this film. And I just don't think this film is ever able to get there. I think the surreal elements of this film really hurt it. When this film gets very essentially non-traditional, I really struggled with this movie, and especially as this film is broken up into 4 acts, which are Mexico City is where we start in the first act, where we are with this William character. He meets Eugene as they're roaming Mexico City. The second act essentially becomes a travel movie where they go to South America. The third act, without spoiling it much, involves these 2 characters going to a rainforest and finding a elusive drug that has interested the Daniel Craig character. And then we get an epilogue, a conclusion 2 years later. That is the breakthrough. The breakdown of the format of this movie. And I think the Mexico City part for me was the most strongest linear part of this movie. Like, that was the part of the movie that I understand the tone, that I understood the appreciation for what Luca was doing here. And I think the epilogue is also extremely strong. It's this South American rainforest where the surreal and magical realism are really taking over, and it's really trying to speak on this essence of a drug for the cinema, the language of film in this movie. It really tested my patience, actually, in the second and third act. I just don't think Luca has a great handle on this film and becomes very wandering. It's a movie that I just felt very directionless for a good hour of this movie. And I think the conclusion it gets to is pretty fascinating and pretty well explored by Luca Guadagnino. But to the resolution to get there is rough. And there's a few characters that pop up in this movie that have good supporting roles. Leslie Manville is very memorable in this movie. To be honest, the third act is really where the film lost me, and that's the scenes where she is in the most. Jason Schwartzman appears in the first act. I thought he was really excellently used in this movie. It's a very funny performance. It's a pretty unrecognizable performance from Jason Schwartzman, but that is where I felt the movie felt its most defined. And people are going to really like this undefined quality that I'm talking about, the surrealist element to it. I just don't think Luca Guadagnino was able to capture it in any way that I found interesting. And I think, again, it is trying to show essentially a person who is trying to fill his life with something, and it doesn't work. Now, when this movie really kicks off is the epilogue of this movie, which I did find pretty moving and emotionally satisfying. The conclusions that it drew, how it tied the themes together, how it's this exploration of trauma, loss. And there is this moment at the end of the film that is a devastating moment of longing and want and this desire to be held and loved. And it's essentially these characters who cannot have that in the context of their life. And it's powerful. It's a truly wonderful moment realized. It's just the film. I struggled to get to that moment, even if I found the payoff to be pretty well worth it. So ultimately, I cannot recommend Queer. I think it's going to be a struggle for a lot of audiences. I think there is certainly going to be an audience that clicks with this movie, that understands it. And this is certainly one that I could see being revisited over the next few years. Like, that is certainly a movie that I wouldn't be shocked to hear people really take a new appreciation for, studied and thought of and examined, and really a product of reclamation. I could definitely see that being that for Queer. Ultimately, I watched this movie about 48 hours ago. I noticed I haven't been able to get it out of my mind, which is always a good thing for me with a movie. A lot of times I watch movies that I think are pretty good, like a good 3-star movie, and it's out of my brain within the next 24 hours. This movie, it's not a 3-star movie for me by any means, it's still in my brain, and there's going to be a lot mulling in there for quite a while. And there's a lot of elements that I really did appreciate within Queer. I don't think this is going to be the mainstream Oscar success that people were predicting. I don't think this is going to be anything like Challengers. This film is far more harder to engage in than a film like Call Me By Your Name, even a film like Bones and All. If I had to describe this anything related to Luca's past work, I think the film Suspiria would be the closest comparison I could have to it. But ultimately, I am going to err on the side of hesitation, and I'm going to say 2 out of 5 stars, with the fact that I think there is more to like about this than a normal 2-star movie. It's just ultimately this frustration of not feeling in grasp or understanding of a chunk of the film and finding it quite aimless. Really, just I noticed it grating on me, and I felt kind of just exhausted by the time we got to a really wonderful conclusion. With that all said, if you like this movie, let me know in the comments below. Let me know why you like this movie. And if you disliked it, let me know as well. I want to hear everyone's opinions on this movie. I'll be back later this week. Tuesday, I will have a review of the Netflix film Maria, which has been getting a lot of Oscar buzz for its main performance from Angelina Jolie. And I will be reviewing Thursday Mufasa, the Lion King. So that should be exciting. So make sure to subscribe for more reviews. Thank you all for watching. Take care. Bye-bye.